alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa afdalu salatu wa taslim. Ala Sayyid al-Anbiya wal Mursaleen. سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم المصطفى الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. You know, yes, it is very cold here. It is very cold. I mean, it's like, wow. But alhamdulillah, I want you all to give these brothers another round of applause. You know? Access Healing Center. You know where they took me today? They took me to Hamdi Coffee. Wallahi, that was the first time I ever tasted Somali tea. I thought I had Somali tea from a Somali restaurant in LA. I did not have Somali tea. MashaAllah, right? Like that's, so alhamdulillah, that's the highlight of this trip, alhamdulillah. I don't care about the code anymore. Another thing that I want to say to you all before I get started is this. MashaAllah, when it comes to helping people with recovery, I believe that here in Minneapolis, you are actually ahead of everyone else in the country. And the reason why is, we have almost 1 million Muslims in Southern California. And we don't have half of what you all have here. We're working on it. We're working on it. But what they are doing, they are like the vanguard. You know, they're the pioneers. And I expect many, many great things from them. You know, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it so. Whenever we want to talk about addiction, there's different ways that you can approach it. Okay? And notice I'm using the word addiction. And so I'm not just talking about chemical addictions. I'm also talking about behavioral addictions, like gambling, or pornography. You know, somebody becomes addicted to pornography, or social media, or shopping, or eating. There's a whole range of things that people can become addicted to, not just substances. Physiologically, the process is the same. It's just outwardly, it's different, right? Sometimes there's a biological dependence that it may be different, but physiologically, at the neurotransmitter level, it's the same thing. The same thing is happening. When a gambling addict sees a pack of cards, he has the same physiological response in his brain that someone that has a chemical addiction to, right? They have the same exact physiological response. So anyway, we can start there. We can look at it physiologically. We can also look at it theoretically. There's been a lot of papers written on addiction, hundreds of thousands of papers. We can approach it academically. We can approach it experientially. Someone who's actually been there, but they don't know the theories. They don't know the physiologically what is happening. They don't know that, but they can tell you what's going on with their body. They can tell you what's going on with their cravings and their impulses. So inshallah, what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try to give you a little bit of all of that. I know it's a tall task. You guys probably want to get out of here early, but we're getting ready to go on a little journey, inshallah. I hope that was a yes. So I'm going to start with myself, experientially. Because of a lot of different things, when I was sick, first of all, I want to say this. I was born and raised Muslim, just like many of you. Born and raised Muslim, my parents were practicing Muslims. But there's a lot of things that happen. Trauma, different types of dislocation, what's going on in the house, doesn't resemble what's going on in the real world. There's a difference between what's happening at school and what's happening in the house. And eventually what ends up happening is we make a choice. And my choice was at 16 years old, I ended up in the streets. All right? And when I ended up in the streets, I didn't have enough work experience to get a good job at 16. I didn't have I didn't have enough work experience, nor did I have the resume that would get me a good job. So the lowest hanging fruit for a black man in America to make money is to sell drugs. They're everywhere. And you can make a lot of money real fast. So that's what happened with me. I started selling drugs. And I got very, very good at it very, very quickly for a couple of reasons. Number one, I was born and raised Muslim. What's he saying? I wasn't gonna cheat you. Those of you who know the streets, you know it's cutthroat, right? You can lose your life out there. But if you dealt with me, I wasn't gonna be cutthroat with you. If I said I was gonna bring you a $20 rock of crack, that's exactly what I was gonna bring you. And if you loaned me some drugs and you said, hey man, you owe me $5,000, you're not gonna get $4,500 or $4,900, you're gonna get back $5,000. So I very quickly moved through the ranks and became an expert dope dealer. I was living in Colorado at the time. It's still not as cold as it is here, right? But, very quickly, I attracted some attention from people from LA, and they started bringing the drugs to me out in Colorado. And I became very rich very quick. Now, during that time period, when I reflect back, I saw all types of addictions. I saw people who were addicted to drugs. I saw people who were addicted to sex. I saw people who were addicted to what we rarely talk about, power. Addicted to power. And I myself developed a bad habit for fast money. And it didn't play out then and there when I was young, because by the time I was 20, I kind of understood, okay, I got to give this up. I got to get back on my deen. I got to start practicing again, because the streets are treacherous. They teach you lessons real fast. There were shootouts, investigations started, feds started looking at us, so I started to back out. But at that time, I didn't necessarily know how to remove the vice of greed from my soul. So it stayed with me. It stayed with me. I moved back to California, and I got married, started having kids, and everything was okay. But that greed is right there under the surface. And then I got a chance to sell drugs again, but at a much higher level. I didn't have to see the streets. All I had to do was pick up and drop off. Pick up and drop off. I go pick up a package. The package is worth $300,000. Drop it off. I walk away with $500,000. The whole operation I'll be done in 4 days. There's that greed. To make a long story short, I ended up catching a federal case. And they gave me 17 and a half years in prison. Right? Alhamdulillah. I don't know what your politics are here in Minnesota. I don't know if you like Obama or not. Right? But when Obama came to office, one of the things that he did was he benefited us by reducing the sentences of those that had drug charges with no violence in their record. I benefited from that, so I ended up doing 11 years in prison and then coming home. What got me interested in this work was while I was in prison, I had a chance, you become a mentor. There's a lot of young people, I was by the time when I went to prison, I was in my late 20s. And there's guys coming in there 18, 19, 20, right? They haven't lived life. You have to understand, by this time, I had traveled the world. I had been to Asia, Europe, many times, North Africa, South America, and so I had lived life before I went into prison. But I'm coming into contact with people, they have never left their neighborhood. And so I was like a leader in prison, and I had a little bit more Islamic education than a lot of them. So I was always the imam everywhere I went. But now I'm coming into contact with people who, they had addictions, but they became Muslim. I've got to teach them the Fatiha. He only has a 5th grade education. He wants to learn about the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but he can't read a basic textbook that I give him to read, so I've got to actually sit there and teach him. And in that process, I become his father, his brother, his mentor, and I came face to face with what I was doing. I was trafficking in this that caused him to be the way he is. I was trafficking in it. We was moving dope all across the country. Perhaps it was one of my packages that got his mother addicted, that got him abused, into foster care, and eventually into prison. And I dealt with that for 11 years. So I started counseling. I started teaching. And in reality, what I was doing, I was making tawbah. I was asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya Allah, help me to rectify my situation and help me to rectify their situation. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me insight into what causes addiction and how to help. This is all experiential. We're not theoretical yet. I hadn't been to college. I didn't even have an associate's degree by that time, or a master, or bachelor's, and eventually to become a mental health professional, you have to have a master's. I didn't have none of that. So this is the level of experience. Face to face with people with heroin addicts. They're heroin addicts. They were crack addicts, or their parents were, and it's what ended them up in prison. All right? All right. What is addiction? What is addiction? Addiction. Try to remember these 3 things, because we're going to be talking about it for the rest of the night. Inshallah. It is any behavior that you do temporarily for relief or pleasure. Any behavior. Notice I didn't say a chemical. It's any behavior that you do for temporary relief or pleasure, but it has long-term detrimental consequences. Despite those consequences, you can't give it up. That's addiction. Right? 3 things. You do it for pleasure or relief. It has detrimental long-term consequences. You can't give it up. That's addiction. All right? So now the question is, why do people become addicted to whatever? Notice I'm not just talking about chemicals. Right? Chemicals is very, very important because people overdose all the time. But any addiction is detrimental to your holistic health, your mental health, your spiritual health, your intellectual health. Any type of addiction is harmful. All Why would someone choose to be shackled to some type of detrimental behavior? Like, who does that? Who would do that? You cannot only look at what is wrong with the addiction or the person who is addicted. You have to look at what's right with it. What is right with the addiction? So the first question you have to ask someone who has an addiction is, what does it do for you? So it helps me to relieve my stress. Okay, he's telling you, or she's telling you, they don't have distress tolerance. They don't know how to relieve stress. Well, they might say, it gives me a sense of purpose. Okay, without it, they don't know what their purpose is. All right? What is right with it? That will give you insight into what you have to do to help them. You'll find that people will say to you, I feel broken. Using the substances helps to fix my brokenness. They will say, I feel meaninglessness. I don't know why I'm here, what I'm supposed to do when I'm here. But when I get high, or when I'm doing something that has to do with my addiction, right, I feel fulfilled. They are trying to fill their emptiness using an outward means. All right? And sometimes you know what the alternative is to using the substances? Suicide. So sometimes the addiction is a means. It's actually a solution that's temporary, that they're trying to fill. So they're trying to solve an inner problem using outward means. So it's self-soothing behavior, or I can say this. I can actually say this. It's a normal response to abnormal circumstances. Addiction. It's a normal response to abnormal circumstances. What do I mean by that? Most people that suffer addiction have immense amount of suffering from one of three areas. How many of you have heard of ACEs? ACEs. Adverse childhood experiences. So they've experienced or they've witnessed violence. They have experienced or witnessed abuse, neglect, losing a loved one. And there's no one there to fill up the space of that loss. This is a predisposition to addiction, and any type of addiction. So ACEs. This is one of the first things you look at. Another thing that you can look at, and there's a really, really good book written by, his name is Bruce Alexander. Have you ever heard of Rat Park? He did all these experiments on rats. What would make them addicted? And he came to a lot of very relevant conditions, and he has a theory that dislocation is a predisposition to addiction. So what's dislocation? Concrete loss. You lose a family member. You lose your culture, your traditional spirituality. He also said loss of freedom. You know, like people who go to prison, you know, they don't have ways of finding joy and meaning in their life. It predisposes you to addiction. All right, it sets the table for the person. And also a lack of opportunities. If a person has a lack of opportunities, addiction many times is the very next step. All right? And then lastly, just trauma. Trauma. Trauma is a psychological wound. It's a psychological, so in other words, like you have an outward wound and it needs to be treated and healed. Same thing psychologically. If you have a psychological wound and it never gets healed, predisposition to addiction. You see where I'm going? Nobody wants to be addicted to anything. But because of the world that we live in, the breakdown of culture, right? The breakdown of family ties, the support structures. You know, modernity is very, very good at breaking down spirituality. It just becomes about the hustle every day. Back to work, 8 hours, back home, right? Modernity breaks down what normally would make you a human being. Breaks it down. Now trauma, like I said, it's a psychological, it's a psychological wound, right? It's not the event that happens, right? May Allah protect us. But myself, for example, myself and Musab, we can be in a car accident. And he'll get out the car and just shake it off. Like, man, I'm traumatized. I don't want to get in a car. I don't want nothing that has 4 wheels at all, period. I've been traumatized. It's not the event. It's what happened to me inside as a result of the event. That's trauma. And that's not the only definition of trauma. If you're supposed to get something and you don't get it, that's also trauma. Like love, when you're young. Attachment, that's trauma. You know, there's endorphins that the child experiences. You know, endorphins is like the natural opiates in the brain that a person receives. A baby receives when he's cooing with the mother. The mother is playing with him. Hey, and the baby's watching her facial expressions. There's opiates that are released in his brain. If that doesn't happen for the child, the first time he experiences artificial opiate, like fentanyl, he got what he never got when he was young. He's addicted. Right? So a lot of times, it's not the substance, it's not the cards. Every single one of us, when we see a card, a deck of cards, we don't become addicted. So that's not the problem. When we see food, we eat food every day. Hopefully, right? Some people don't. But the vast majority of us, we eat food every day, but we don't become addicted. Right? During the Vietnam War, 20% of the soldiers that came back from Vietnam were addicted to heroin. 20%. Over a couple of years, it dropped down to 5%. Why? Because it wasn't the substance. It was the conditions in Vietnam that had them addicted. That's what had them addicted. So many times what you'll find is that it's the events that happen in their life, those experiences. They didn't get what they needed when they're in their formative years. So the first time they try a substance or pornography or whatever, they're hooked because that experience gave them what they didn't get when they were young. Y'all with me? I mean, if y'all bored, just let me know. Just let me know. All right. Now, let's talk a little bit about healing. Healing. So healing, it means to become whole. You go from a state of brokenness, or you can think of a wound that's wide open, physical wound, a cut or something like that, it's wide open, we say that it's healed when it closes up. Right? It's better. All right? Healing is to be able to experience the self as it is. As it is. Many times when we're young, we get separated from our true selves. Right? We've got to please the imam at the masjid. We've got to please our teachers. We've got to please our parents. We have to please, and it's done many times in a way that separates us from ourselves. And so what you have to do is you have to relearn yourself. Who are you? And if you're a minority in this society, you're going to experience that over and over and over and over and over again. And so you'll find that the rates of not necessarily addiction, but of recovery, there's a huge disparity between, the minorities and the majorities in this country. Okay? So, as far as Muslims are concerned, the primary means of healing someone, rahmah, mercy, compassion. This is the primary means. If you want people to hear the truth, if you want people to accept the truth, you have to do it in a very merciful way. Okay? If you want people to, the job of the therapist, and I'm a therapist, I see at least 25 people a week. At least. Plus I run groups and things like that. My job is to help him or her see themselves, because they've got to do the work. They have the tools to become whole, but I have to show them what is broken. That is my job. Okay? Mercy. And the reason why I'm saying this is because how does the Quran begin? How does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduce us to Him? He said, so it starts off with Bismillah, in the name of God, Ar-Rahman, and He tells us who He is. Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. This is how we're introduced to the divine word. Bismillah, in the name of God, or with the name of God, who is most gracious, most merciful. Now Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he gave us an order. The messenger of God, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, he gave us an order. He said, Takhalluq bi akhlaqullah. Adopt the characteristics of God. In other words, God is most merciful. You have to adopt those characteristics. He is patient. You have to adopt that characteristic. But there's a whole surah, there's a whole chapter in the Quran that just talks about mercy. Ar-Rahman. So that's how we have to be. Now, I want to just give some nuances here, right? Because when you go into the masjid and you say, I'm struggling, I have an addiction, my son, my daughter, my brother, my sister, they have an addiction. The imam or the administration of the masjid is going to deal with you legally, shar'an. He's going to deal with you coming from the point of view of the sharia. And there's a reason for that, all right? If you just look at Islamic civilization, you look at Islamic Spain. The Muslims were in Spain for 800 years. Right? Look at Turkey. The Muslims were in Europe for 600 years. Right? This is how Albania and parts of Romania and places like that, that's how they became Muslim. The crowning achievement of Islamic civilization was law. It was law. Fiqh. These are the rules. Do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. So that's the natural default Most Muslims will default to that. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he explained to us the superstructure of deen, he didn't just name law. He said it's Islam, which is the Shahada and the other 4 pillars, right? That's law. But it's Iman, also what we believe. And what we always forget about is what? Ihsan. Spiritual excellence. Spiritual excellence. That's what we always forget about. So when you go to the masjid, they're going to give you law. But this business of making people whole, you have to look at the science of ihsan. That's what you have to look at. All right? So now let me give you some examples. Can you think of a time when the Muslim community was just traumatized? And I'm talking about during the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They were traumatized. Can you think of a time? Anybody? They were traumatized. The whole community. And they were traumatized by actions that they brought on themselves. Because sometimes that's what you'll hear too. Oh, you did it yourself. That's haram, right? That's haram. You're not supposed to do that anyway. We know it's forbidden. We know. We don't need you to tell us that. We need some solutions to how to fix it, right? So, can anyone think of one? I will present to you, I saw your hand. I will present to you the Battle of Uhud. The Battle of Uhud. Rasulullah sallallahu the Messenger of Allah, he gave them an order. Don't leave that mountain. I don't care what happens. If you see us winning, if you see us losing, don't leave that mountain. 40 archers, don't leave that mountain. What did they do? They left. What happened? Over 70 people were killed because they did not obey. They did not listen. Right? There was disastrous consequences because of that. Husbands, brothers, fathers, uncles were killed. They were killed. How did Allah tell the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to deal with them? Even though they had disobeyed. How did he tell them to deal with them? فَبِمَا رَحْمَةً مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ. It is by the mercy of Allah that you are gentle with them. And this is after they disobeyed a direct order. Right? So you may say, oh, they did it to themselves. Yeah, so what? People better than them did it to themselves. And Allah still commanded the Prophet ﷺ to be gentle with them. And then he told them what would happen if he wasn't gentle with them. وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. If you were harsh and hard-hearted with them, they would have fled from around you. Like people flee from the masjid. You see? This is the number one principle in helping people to recover. Whether we're talking about addiction, whether we're talking about anxiety, whether we're talking about depression, you must have mercy. So if you are a counselor, if you are, a therapist, if you're just, you're doing like peer support, the number one quality that you have to have if you're going to help people to recover and become whole, you have to cultivate rahmah. You have to cultivate rahmah. You have to cultivate mercy and compassion. Okay? Mercy and compassion. Now, how does that look? How does it look? Because, right, it's going to be subjective. Everybody's going to say, well, this is how I show my mercy. All right? So this is the way I teach it. Number one, the individual who is suffering, the person who's suffering, the way that he shows mercy to himself, or sometimes we say self-care, all right? And even that definition is arguable. But the first thing they have to do is they have to be courageous enough to start again. they gotta get up and start again. Get up and start again. Get up and start again. Yeah, you're gonna fall and you're gonna fail. And it might not necessarily be your fault, but the way that you show compassion to yourself, get up and start again. Outline your goals and the objectives towards that goal over and over and over and over again. That's how it has to look. At the family level, because most of the time, it's going to be the family that reaches out and says to you, hey, my father, my mother, my sister, right? They're going to be the ones that reach out. And by the time they reach out, most of the time they're at their wits' end. They don't know what to do, okay? One of the things that you can do is, number one, your compassion towards your family member. You have to realize, if it weren't for the grace of God, there you go too, right? You got the same trap doors in your soul. You have the same quicksand in your soul. So there's a hadith recorded by Imam Malik and his Muwatta. It's a hadith collection, collection of prophetic sayings. And he told us that Jesus, Nabi Isa alayhi salam, said that, there's two types of people in the world. There are those who are ibtila, they're mubtala, right? They're under trial and tribulation. They're going through something. And there's mu'afa, there's who are they have overall well-being. Most human beings break down into one of these categories, right? And he said, if the ones who are in a state of well-being don't help the ones who are in a state of trial and tribulation, it's just a matter of time before they will be tested with the same thing. Right? And it may not be that exact thing, but you'll have your own tribulation. You're going to have your own problems. Your trapdoor is going to be the same way. So how should we be? Merciful. Now, this is what I see some families do. A lot of times, what I'll see families do is that they will enable, right? They'll just tolerate everything. They won't set any boundaries. And this is very important that the family sets boundaries. All right, they have to set boundaries for the person. Don't give them money every time they ask and you know what it's going to be used for. All right, you say, no, listen, it's your phone bill, bring it to me electronically, I'll pay with my credit card, right? You set the boundaries. And then the other thing that I see is that they want to, they think that they will not feel better until the person is doing better. That's codependency, right? So these are the two extremes that you'll see families go to. On one hand, the family will, they'll just tolerate everything. I love him, I love her, but there's no boundaries being set. And on the other extreme, they will, they want to correct every single thing that they do. They're suspicious and they're questioning. And actually, you have to be more in the middle. All right? You have to be able to say to them, listen, I see that you're struggling. My job is not to change you. That's not my job. My job is to help you and support you when I see that you're trying to help yourself. So that's how you show compassion at the family level. And then, mashallah, for example, you have Access Healing Center. Inshallah, they're building an institution. You have to have care and concern for the individual that's struggling. That's what happens at the community, at the community level, at the institutional level. And this is something that we have to cultivate in our masajids. This is something that we have to cultivate, in our, Islamic centers, all the different institutions that you have here. We have to be instrumental in teaching our elders, the administrators, the people who, the shot callers, that this spiritual virtue of mercy and compassion in the times that we are living in, it is just as important as knowing the rules of prayer and wudu. Okay? We're helping the person to become responsible. We're helping the person to, responsible, response-able, right? That word. We want them to be able to respond correctly to their suffering. Respond, they have this response ability to correctly respond to their suffering, to their despair, to their doubts, etc. A few more things I want to share with you about mercy. Just about mercy, because I think this is really, really important. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He asks us a question. He says, Liman ma fi samawati wal ard. To who belongs all of the heavens and the earth? To who? And then He tells us, He says, Qul lillah, belongs to Allah. And then in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He asks us a question. He says, Liman ma fi samawati wal ard. To who belongs all of the heavens and the earth? To who? And then He tells us, He says, Qul lillah, belongs to Allah. And then He tells us in the very next verse, Kataba ala nafsihi rahmah. He has obligated for Himself. He has, made it obligatory upon Him to be merciful. So first He says, to who belongs the heavens and the earth? And then He tells you what you'll find. What you will find in the heavens and the earth. And so Rasulullah SAW explains this to us. He says, those who are merciful will be shown mercy by the most merciful. Be merciful to those on the earth, and the one above the heavens will have mercy upon you. You can find this hadith in the Jami of Imam at-Tirmidhi. This is a principle. All right? How we have to conduct all of our affairs. And then another one, we know that the tradition of Aisha radiallahu anha, right? Someone brought, she was sitting with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu and she was feeding him, and somebody else sent a plate of food. And in her moment of jealousy, she smacked the food out of the person's hand. The plate fell on the ground and it broke. And look, Rasulullah SAW immediately got up and he started picking up the pieces of the plate. He gave the person another plate to take back, right? And then he turns to her and he says, Allah, inna Allah rafiq wa yuhibbu rifq. Allah is gentle. Allah is kind. And He loves kindness. And He rewards for kindness what He will never give for harshness. You see, when someone comes to you and they are struggling, they're having a hard time, what Rasulullah SAW is giving us an indication right here, He's letting us know that Allah, He will give results because of your gentleness, because of your kindness, because of your compassion. Well, He will never give if you be stern, legalistic, harsh. He won't. And that story, or that understanding goes on and on and on. I will end with this, right? And anybody who's in this field should learn these things so that when they're dealing with a person, by asking them questions, you can understand where they are. in their recovery. You can understand where they are in their change. You can understand where they are, in their particular addiction. And notice, I'm not just speaking about substances. I'm not just speaking about substances. All right? So number one, there's this, the binging, the intoxication. And as I explained earlier, you'll have people who, they never use substances in their life. All of a sudden they go to college, they get introduced to it, and they're hooked. But their friends are not. Why? They just did it for pleasure, temporary pleasure. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know how they would feel or whatever. But as soon as they feel it, they're hooked. 90% of the time, if you go into their childhood, you'll see why. You'll understand why. And so I want to say something else. So much I want to say. But let me just say this, because I think this is really, really important. The human being, has anybody ever read that book, The Body Keeps the Score? Yeah, I believe that. All right, it's an excellent book. The Body Keeps the Score. What it means is, for your entire life, your nervous system records every single event that happens to you, but not in pictures like your imagination, but in your response to that event. It records it. And we're starting to learn that there's all different types of intelligences. Like, this is starting to become scientifically proven. We know that there's emotional intelligence, right? There's rational intelligence. There's spatial intelligence, like people who know how to fight really, really well. That's because they learn spatial intelligence. They know how to close distances and measure where his head is going to be at in the next 1 second, right? There's all different types of intelligences. Now, the Quran tells us that our bodies have intelligence. What's the sheikh talking about? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran that on the day of judgment, your limbs will speak. Your limbs will testify to everything you did in your life with them. They will testify. This is a type of intelligence, right? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he told us, he said, every morning when you wake up, the limbs plead with the tongue, right? This is in the spiritual realm. In the spiritual realm, the limbs say, please be straight. If you are straight, we'll be straight. But if you are crooked, then we are ruined. But you won't have access to that until the day of judgment. What am I saying? What I'm saying is, every single one of us has some type of response to every single event in our life. From the time you are born, you have implicit, I'm not saying explicit, right? You may not remember the event, but your nervous system will respond. So for example, if people in your family are given to yelling, and you would always wake up, when you were a baby, because people were yelling, your nervous system has recorded that. And when you hear yelling, you have a physical response to it. Your body fills up with adrenaline, the cortisol begins to flow. This is the stress hormone. And then the only thing that makes you feel better and calm is weed. Right? Is it legal here? Yeah. It's legal? Yep. Down the rabbit hole. Right? And so sometimes when you talk to the person, they may not have explicit memories of trauma. They may not know what happened to them before, because you don't start actually remembering things until you are about 2.5, 3 years old. Then you can start actually having pictures that go along with your experiences. But before that, your nervous system is remembering everything. If you just watch a 1-year-old who just began to learn how to walk, just watch how they respond when they get ready to stumble and fall. They've fallen before. And when it begins to happen again, they try to catch themselves because they don't want to be hurt again. But their memory is not developed enough. It's the nervous system that's saying, hey, don't do that again. You remember what happened. Don't do that. So when a person gets addicted, sometimes they may not be able to tell you what happened. If you can bring it out, but you can still help them to heal even without knowing explicitly everything that happened. All right? So that's the first thing, right? So you have this this binging. And I'm saying binging because it might not be substances, right? It might be, like I said, it could be gambling or pornography or shopping. It can be those things. All right? So they're experiencing the rewards. They're experiencing, all the pleasure that goes along with it. And then this leads to increased consumption, for that effect. Yeah. Now, what happens is that eventually you begin to develop tolerance, right? This is what makes people increase. You notice, so for example, so I came here and I drank that tea. MashaAllah. I had the tea. Right? You got your own mall and everything, right? Alhamdulillah. So, but what's gonna happen if I start drinking it every day? I'm gonna love it at first, but eventually the pleasure that goes along with it goes away. So I need more of it. All right? So this is when we begin to have the negative effect. And especially when you're talking about substances, you're beginning to watch the person, they begin to change. You begin to see that they're beginning to develop some type of dependence on the behavior or the substance. All right? So, that's when they begin to talk about withdrawal. Right? They can't be without it. There's effects to withdrawal. They might, and if they're physically dependent upon it, they will have, they might have like diarrhea or vomiting or, all kinds of different, especially if it's an opioid. It's not as bad with stimulants, but with opioids, there's normally a physical dependence. Okay. And then the preoccupation or the addiction. That's when that sets in. And what was addiction again? Those three things? Who can tell me? What was addiction?
Behavior that is repetitive, that seeks relief and seeks pleasure. Yes.
Okay. There's one missing. There was one missing. Yes. So, addiction is you do it for temporary relief or pleasure. There's detrimental, right, long-term effects, but you can't give it up. Right? Those three things. That's how addiction happens. So don't let anybody tell you, oh, that's what you wanted. That's what they wanted. That's what they chose. It doesn't work like that. There are social determinants. There's things, most of the time, there are things that happen in the person's life, or what should have happened didn't happen. And that is what opens up the trap door, right? Or creates the quicksand pit. All right, that's how that happens.